Hello, everybody, and welcome to Box Seat Banter. I'm your host, Billy Ballas, and joining me today is Wick Terrell, the writer for the SB Nation blog Red Reporter. He's also a host of the Red Reporter podcast. You can find him on Twitter. It's at Wick Terrell, and he runs the Red Reporter Twitter as well, and that's at Red Reporter Wick. I'm very happy to have you on the show. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's hopefully going to be a fun year in Cincinnati Reds land, and excited to talk about them.
Yeah, and so we are broadcasting live from the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame and Museum in Cincinnati. And as we talk about the Reds, now professional baseball began in Cincinnati. It was a prior version of the Reds. They were the Red Stockings in 1869, the first completely professional team. And that is why what used to be the case is the first game of the year, opening day, would always open in Cincinnati. They've got that opening day parade there. And, now ESPN kind of screws up how they do opening day. This year was obviously a little bit different. But, the Reds traditionally open at home, and it is to honor the beginning of professional baseball in Cincinnati. The Reds were a charter member of the American Association. That's this current version of the Reds. In 1882, they moved to the National League. In 1890, and they played in this time frame. They played in Riverfront Stadium from 1970 to 2002. And then they moved into Great American Ballpark in 2003. That's where they've been since. They're currently in Great American Ballpark. And Wick, Great American, it's a it's a sponsor name, but as far as sponsor names, I think that's the best sponsor name for a ballpark. Don't you agree?
Yeah, Great American Insurance Company. They built their, I don't even know exactly how tall it is. It's roughly 50 stories, but they built their brand new office tower right behind the stadium, right on the riverfront downtown. So if you don't manage to catch Great American Ballpark sign on the side of the stadium as you go by, there's an even bigger one higher up on the front of the building right next to it also. So local company, and it does roll off the tongue pretty well. That's for sure.
It's a perfect name. It's a lot better than what is it, like Guaranteed Rate Field or whatever they got in the South Side in Chicago and some of these other names. So that's a great name for a ballpark. It describes a ballpark, right? Great American Ballpark.
It does, and it's a Great American Home Run Park as well. They, if you go back a little bit, and you mentioned it opened in 2002. The Ken Griffey Jr. trade and massive contract extension came in the end of 1999 for the start of the 2000 season, and that was back when he was still healthy and still chasing. At that point, it was I guess it was Hank Aaron's record for home runs, and there's a lot of people out there that will straight up tell you that short right field porch over there was built so Griffey could chase that record. Unfortunately, didn't work out that way, but a lot of hitters have benefited from that design over the years since then.
Yeah. Now the Reds are not the only team in Ohio. The currently the Cleveland Indians, we'll see if they change their name anytime soon, are also in Ohio. And they have played annually in a preseason baseball game from 1989 to 1996, the Ohio Cup, where the winner received the Ohio Cup. It ended in 97 when interleague play came about. But since 2008, the Ohio Cup has been awarded to the team who wins the season series. Is that, a big rivalry? Do the Reds consider the Indians a rival?
I think it's a rivalry that should be bigger than it is. Honestly, it's something that I think I knew intrinsically, but hadn't actually seen until this past weekend when the Reds were hosting the Detroit Tigers. Of all 30 Major League Baseball teams, the Reds have the worst interleague record since they started interleague play. So obviously playing the Cleveland Baseball Club every single year hasn't helped a lot with that. They've struggled in that a lot. There have been some big moments in it, though. There's no denying that. And I think it's a game that I think both fan bases wish both teams were better more often so that it would be a bigger thing. If anything, it's kind of weird, though, because back in 2007, the Reds moved their spring training facility from Florida to Arizona when they opened the new Goodyear Ballpark, and now Cleveland and Cincinnati share that spring ballpark. So they play each other a whole lot during the spring as well. They share facilities, so it's almost kind of like it's almost like a brotherly matchup at this point more than it is a fierce rivalry. But certainly, you get to the central portion of Ohio, especially once you get around Columbus, and you see Cleveland flags and Reds flags right next to each other because it certainly is a battleground state in that regard.
Very nice. So yeah, and in this time period, going back to 1995, the Reds have 3 division titles, winning the NL Central in 95, 2010, and 2012. Also won the wild card in 2013. Now in this era, they have not won the pennant at all, so no World Series titles either. They do have 5 World Series champs overall, going back to 1919. You know, that's a very famous World Series for the Black Sox scandal of the Chicago White Sox of 1919. The Reds are not often remembered for winning that series, but it was the Reds who won that. They also won in 1940. Then the Big Red Machine in 75 and 76, one of the great dynasties in baseball. And then in 1990, again, led by a staff with Jose Rio on that team. Do you have any favorite kind of Red teams from the past, Wick?
So I actually grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, which is about 70 miles south of Cincinnati, but is firmly in Reds country. My dad's whole family is all from the Cincinnati area. So I grew up a Reds fan from the start and was a child of the 80s. So I was just old enough in 1990 to really kind of, on the big old boxy television, experience that team, and that was kind of when my Reds fandom was born. So that 1990 club was, I mean, obviously it had Barry Larkin, it had Lou Piniella, it had Jose Rio healthy, and when he was healthy, he was as dominant as they could come. They had an Eric Davis who, up until Game 1, was healthy also, so a lot of star power on that team, but still was kind of the underdog. I mean, they were up against an Oakland club with McGuire, Canseco, and Eckersley, and everybody else, Ricky Henderson, and that club winning the way they did, sweeping them 4-0, was definitely the club that really kind of seared the Reds into my fandom. But won't lie, my dad had a lot of Big Red Machine memorabilia up all around the house growing up, and ticket stubs from the '76 series and all of that. Cincinnati's not Cincinnati, actually the opposite of that. Reds country is really a weird, interesting fandom because the city of Cincinnati is not as big as it used to be, but it's such a regional club. And you've got cities like Lexington and Evansville and Louisville and Columbus and Dayton all around the region that are all, you know, an hour away from Cincinnati or roughly. But the Reds really are a big draw for that entire region. So it's interesting to kind of run into Reds fans from not just Cincinnati, because there are so many of them that are kind of spread out. So many of which you can trace back from when a generation before the Reds were so good, and you could listen to them on the radio in like a 6-state area. So yeah, Reds fandom runs deep in my family and runs deep for pretty much everybody who grew up in the region, in large part because of that Big Red Machine club.
All right. Well, you certainly bring a lot of knowledge, a lot of Reds knowledge to the show. So I'm looking forward to all the insight that you bring throughout the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's hopefully we've got more recent Red stuff to talk about after this year. It's been a long 6-year rebuild, but yeah, you know, those early 2010s teams were really, really talented, and they tore that down to build towards something. And it's taken a long time, but hopefully, and in theory, this 2020 club is supposed to be that first real emerging from the rebuild season. So knock on wood, we can make that happen this year.
Last week's trivia question about the Pirates, actually 2 weeks ago, since last week we had Alex Friedman on the program. About the Pirates, the question was who had the most opening day starts for the Pirates in the past quarter century? And now that's at any position. Wick, I know you're not a Pirates guy. You do play, you know, the Reds play in the same division, so maybe you have some knowledge. Do you have a guess before I reveal the answer?
The last quarter century, so it's from 95 on.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's I feel like there's a lot of guys that are all at about 6 or 7 years. McCutchen maybe, Cervelli maybe, but before that, maybe even Brian Giles. Yeah, I might go with Brian Giles.
Okay. The answer, the guest, last week's guest, his guess was McCutchen. McCutchen was incorrect. It's actually Jason Kendall at catcher.
Kendall, yeah.
Which is it's kind of impressive for a catcher to, you know, start that, you know, that many games. Of course, he had that gruesome injury, but yeah, he was a mainstay on those kind of mid-90s Pirates to the early 2000s. But now that brings me to the Reds trivia question. Now, the last we mentioned, they've had a rich history, 5 World Series titles. But in this time period, going back to 1995, the Reds have one playoff series win. They swept the Dodgers in the 1995 NLDS. Who won the clinching game for the Reds in that Game 3 over the Dodgers?
So the 95 Reds had, oh gosh, it was Game 3. I know they traded for David Wells at the trade deadline that year. I'm going to say David Wells.
Okay, good. Yeah, David Wells, is associated with the Blue Jays, with the Yankees. But yeah, okay, so yeah, he did play briefly for the Reds, so yeah, it's a good guess. Now the Reds were owned by Marge Schott from 84 to 99. She was, I believe, the second female primary principal owner in Major League Baseball. Carl Lindner Jr. owned the team from 99 to 05. And now the current owner is Bob Castellini. He's on the team from 05. Do you have any opinions on any of the owners or anything?
I've got some strong opinions on Marge Schott.
I think a lot of people do.
Kind of hard not to.
Yeah, she had strong opinions on other people, which kind of made people not think so highly of her at times.
Yeah, 100%. And she actually donated a bunch of money upon her death to the University of Cincinnati. So the University of Cincinnati has actually had her name on their baseball stadium for years since then, which I think they voted just a couple months ago to take off. It was actually kind of spearheaded by some Cincinnati products like Kevin Youkilis, who was very vocal about making sure that name was no longer up there. So the Reds, it took them a while to begin to distance themselves from the Schott era, but I believe they're doing a better job lately from that, and I'm very, very happy they are. The Castellini era has been much, much different. Obviously they had that good success. They took over in the mid-aughts. They brought in all their people. They drafted well. They drafted extremely well towards the end of that decade. I mean, guys like Joey Votto and Jay Bruce and Homer Bailey all got drafted in that 4 or 5 year window. They signed Johnny Cueto. They really went heavy on scouting, and it paid off big time. And that's what you saw from 2010 to 2013 was a sustained run of excellence that was largely self-built. And the problem is that they didn't commit money to keeping that core together. And that's when things kind of fractured. And it's been a very long, long rebuild as a result of that. So I think all told, the Castellini era, it's been more good than bad. And I say that despite the fact that there hasn't been a whole lot of winning. There was that good sustained era. They put a whole lot of money into developing Great American Ballpark for the 2015 All-Star Game and really, really turned it into a fantastic facility. I think that's going to be one of the enduring legacies of this particular ownership group. It's also a family thing. His son, Phil, is the COO and has been for a better part of a decade now. Dick Williams, even the guy who was technically the GM, but now the president of baseball operations, but still kind of functioning as GM. His family's been minority owners of the club as well for years. And so he's invested both in the front office and in ownership. They're committed to kind of doing that kind of ownership style, which doesn't always work, but that's kind of how it is with the Reds. And so you can't really expect a whole lot of drastic change from them consistently. But assuming this particular window of investment where they sunk $160+ million into the club this past offseason, assuming this era begins to kind of develop and take off a little bit more, I think I'll have generally positive views about the Castellinis because they have at least begun to put their money where their mouth is. It just took them a while to do so.
Yeah, now you mentioned Dick Williams, so we'll get to the GMs. Now, Jim Bowden was the GM from 92 to 03. I think he was like the youngest GM at the time when he took over. He was the one who had that trade for Griffey in the 99 offseason. Then Dan O'Brien was GM from 03 to 06. Wayne Krivsky, 06 to 08. Then Walt Jocketty from 08 to 15. He was the orchestrator of those playoff teams there in 2010, 12, and 13. And then Dick Williams, as you mentioned, 2016 to 18. So now he's the president of baseball operations. It's kind of the fancy new baseball title that front offices have invented recently. And Nick Krall has been the GM since 2018. So do you have any kind of favorite GMs from this period?
Yeah, it's been interesting because there's also been an overlap. Even when Dick Williams took over as GM, Walt Jocketty got promoted technically to a senior baseball advisor and was still part of the front office too. So there's been, when I mentioned there's no drastic change with this this family style ownership group, they kind of phase things in and phase things out. And Nick Krall's been a part of the organization. I want to say he was a bat boy when he first got started in all this, and has worked his way up through the analytic department. The current iteration of Reds front office, I think, is more heavily invested in analytics than it ever has been. And I think you saw that a lot in some of the moves they made this particular winter. I like the combination of Williams and Krall. It's almost like they've broken out a little bit more of the financial aspect of it with Williams and the actual player evaluation analytics stuff with Nick Krall. They've worked together for a long time before. Krall was an assistant GM under Dick Williams. They really do seem to work very well together. Most of the moves they've made so far, I've been generally on board with. That's not to say they haven't taken some risks. Obviously, going out and getting Trevor Bauer midseason last year and giving up Taylor Trammell in that package was a big deal for a team that wasn't going anywhere. The early returns weren't good, but obviously they've got Bauer again for this year. I like the way the front office operates now a lot more than I did 10, 12, 15 years ago because they got much more analytically based and a lot less scouting based. And it's, it's an evolution that took a lot longer than other teams did, I think. But I think they're in a pretty good situation right now with that too.
All right. Now, looking back at some of their managers, I've got a little kind of fact or trivia bit about them. And let's see if you can identify the manager from those facts. So they had a manager who, as a player, set the single season record for home runs by a second baseman, and this record still stands. 42 home runs. He was also a Gold Glove winner at second base. You have any idea who that was?
That sounds like Davey Johnson.
It is, yes. Davey Johnson managed the ball club from 93 to 95. I mean, I don't remember him being, and I think even before that, his high was 18 home runs or something.
Yeah, he had that one big year. That's why I remember when he said the 42 home runs. I was like, oh yeah, Davey did have that one freak year where he hit everything all the ballpark. That was a fun era of Cincinnati Reds baseball for sure.
They had another manager who, as a player, scored the very famous winning run in Game 6 of the 1986 World Series, and he was the World Series MVP in 86.
Oh, Lord. Is that Ray Knight?
It is Ray Knight.
Ray Knight.
Ray Knight. I mean, it's, the very famous Vin Scully call. Little roller up along first behind the bag. It gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it. So that was Ray Knight.
I think I get so caught up watching the ball go through Buckner's legs in that video that I kind of forget who comes around to score. But I was like, 86 Mets, who would that have been? Ray Knight.
Yeah, so Ray Knight managed the ball club from 96 to 97. Now we come to a manager who – I think I wasted a good trivia question on him in a prior podcast. I didn't want to repeat. He never reached the majors as a player, but he was a player manager in the minors at age 24.
That was Sparky, wasn't it?
No. It was Jack McKeon.
That was Jack McKeon. Yeah.
So, 97 to 2000. Then
that's right.
We have a manager. He was a second-generation ball player as part of a 3-generation baseball family.
The second generation, well, that's interesting because is it a Bell or is it a Boone?
Right, those are the two options pretty much.
It's got to be, was it Bob Boone?
Bob Boone, yes.
Bob Boone, yeah.
Also a descendant of Daniel Boone.
I am too.
Oh, interesting. And Aaron Boone, his son, was on that Reds team under Bob. Now, Bob managed the team from 01 to 03. Brett Boone also played for the Reds, but earlier, not under Bob Boone. And Aaron Boone is also, he's a manager now. So, yeah, definitely a lot of baseball history in that Boone family.
Yeah.
Yeah, then this one manager, I couldn't find anything real interesting on him. My Wikipedia searching of Dave Miley did not come up anything interesting.
How did I know that was going to be Dave Miley?
Dave Miley managed the squad from 03 to 05. And the next manager, he was Israel's third base coach in the 2017 World Baseball Classic.
Oh, there were so many managers in that 6-year window. Who was it? They fired Miley and they promoted no, it wasn't the pitching coach. Which one was that one?
This
I'm
was
stumped.
Jerry Narron.
Jerry Narron, that's right. Yeah.
05 to 07. And then another guy who I could not really find anything on. He I think he finished the 07 season. Pete Mackinnon.
Pete Mackinnon, who went on to be, I think, an interim manager with the Phillies at some point after that, after they fired somebody else whose staff he was working on. Yeah. Like he had 2 half seasons to his credit as a manager.
And now we come to a manager who there's really a lot of trivia on this guy, but I didn't want to get too obvious with it. So he was on deck when Hank Aaron hit home run number 715.
The purported inventor of the high five, recently extended by the Houston Astros, Dusty Baker.
Baker, yep. And that was one of the trivia questions I could have gone with, the high five. Also likes to chew on toothpicks. But yes, Dusty Baker managed the squad from 08 to 2013. So he was at the helm for those division titles and World wild card teams in that era. Then they had a manager who went on an expletive-filled rant with the media using the F word 77 times.
We had a lot of fun in the blogosphere with Brian Price's rant. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. He'd never been a manager before, had great success as a pitching coach with the Reds and with other organizations beforehand. I think that was one of those positions where the Reds thought they were going to lose him if they didn't promote him. And I don't think he was cut out to be a manager at the big league level, but they rolled the dice and it didn't work.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of pitching coaches make that jump to manager. I know Mickey Callaway tried with the Mets. That didn't exactly work out. Now he's bounced back to being a pitching coach with the Angels. Sometimes it does work out, but most of the time, the managers are catchers, infielders, sometimes outfielders, but rarely pitchers.
I'm trying to think. Like Bud Black was a pitching coach.
Yes, that's one of the few kind of success stories I can think of.
I think that's the one I think of because he's the one that you can think of.
Yeah,
it's really not any other options out there. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we come to a manager who has been an interim manager for 4 different organizations, and 2 of those turned into full-time jobs.
Interim manager for 4 different organizations, and 2 of them turned into full-time jobs. That wouldn't be Lou, was it?
No.
Lou Piniella? No, it's not. Who? I don't know.
Jim Riggleman.
Riggleman. Oh, I forgot it. How can you possibly forget about the Jim Riggleman era in the middle of this massive Cincinnati Reds rebuild? Yeah, the Wriggler. That's right.
Yeah. And then now
Cubs manager. Yeah.
Now we get to another big league family. This is another 3rd-generation big leaguer and 2nd-generation manager, one of 6 father-son pairs to manage.
David Bell.
Yes, David Bell, who also went to the same high school as Ken Griffey Jr.
Moeller High School, Cincinnati legend. Absolutely. Was quite impressive there as a high schooler. No doubt about it.
Yeah, so that's the kind of the managers of the Reds in that past quarter century. Do you have any favorite managers in that time period?
There were a lot of them. There were more than I could remember. That's for sure. It's almost like I tried to block out several of those stages. And it's got to be Dusty. I mean, he's one of the more charismatic human beings that you come across. He's one of the more sincere people you ever come across, and definitely a players manager more so than an analytics manager. And yes, it coincided with the best years of that stretch, undeniably. But he contributed a significant amount to that, I think. And I'm not sure Dusty would be the right manager for the Reds right now, but he certainly was during that era, and it was a very, very, very entertaining era of Cincinnati baseball, and was a big Dusty fan.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. Then, in my opinion, I did not like seeing him, kind of get fired in Washington. I thought he kind of got a bad rap there. He belongs managing a team, but I'm not happy seeing him manage that Houston team right now, because I want Dusty to be successful, but don't want Houston to be successful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he was admirable in his exit with the Reds also. The reports were after they'd slumped in 2013, still won 90 games, lost the wild card game, but after the 97 win season in 2012, it kind of seemed to be slipping a little bit. And the front office wanted to make some coaching changes. And he basically said, if you're going to fire my coaches, I'm gone too. And he took it and just left as a result. And it was certainly one of those instances where you realize the character of the person you're talking about at that point in time. And when I say my admiration for Dusty, a lot of it is rooted just as much in that series of decisions then as it was in all the games he won.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a nice look at the managers, and as you mentioned, there were a lot of them in the past quarter century. Now it's time to review the roster for the Reds that I've created, and a quick reminder for our listeners. The rules of this roster, you go back 25 years, so we're going back to 1995. You pick one player per season. You cannot repeat players, and you have to form a coherent roster, and you get the player for that specific season. So starting at the catching position, we've got Devin Mesoraco from 2014, worth just under 5 wins. He hit 25 home runs, drove in 80, OPS plus of about 147. So a solid year from the catching position that year. At first base, the obvious player for the Reds in this past quarter century, Joey Votto, is just a matter of what year I was going to pick for him. And I got 2015. He was worth 7.8 wins, led the league in walks. Shocker, 143 walks. Triple slash line of 314, 459, 541 for an even 1,000 OPS. Now, Wick, Joey Votto, Hall of Famer or not?
I could spend 17 hours talking about Joey Votto in his Hall of Fame case. I think he is 100%. His rate stats are off the charts. You look at on-base percentages basically in the live ball era, and it's Barry Bonds, Ted Williams, and Votto. And when you play a game where there are a finite number of outs, and you are one of the 3 greatest players at not making outs, I think that pretty much speaks for itself. So Votto has been an absolute joy to watch. It's part of the reason, he's a huge reason why I write about baseball. I won't lie about that, because watching him do what he does on a day-to-day basis has been, it's been elite. It's been a Hall of Fame category as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, definitely great on-base skills, and those are appreciated much more these days than they were previously. Now he does play first base. First base is a tough position to get in, but yeah, that will be an interesting discussion when he is Hall of Fame eligible. Moving along to second base, Brandon Phillips in 2011. That dude BP, worth 4.9 wins, hit 18 home runs, hit 300. He was an all-star, a gold glover, and a silver slugger that year. And he's definitely always known for flashing the leather. Moving along to third base, we've got Scott Rowland in 2010. Also, another guy known for his glove. He hit 285 that year, hit 20 home runs. He was an all-star and gold glover. I think he, spent most of his time in Philadelphia and St. Louis, but a brief time there in Cincinnati. And then at shortstop, just kind of making it on the early end of this time period, we've got the Hall of Famer Barry Larkin in 1996, 7.2 wins, hit 298, 410, 567. Tremendous production out of the shortstop position, hit 33 bombs, swiped 36 bags. And, he's, I imagine, just one of the fan favorites in Cincinnati all those years.
Yeah, well, Cincinnati local, spent his entire career with the Reds, was really just the cornerstone of all the good teams that I watched growing up. And you mentioned his stats that year. Fortunately, that was one of the years where he managed to stay healthy for the bulk of the season. That was the one knock about his career. Of course, he was playing on the concrete AstroTurf of Riverfront Stadium for his entire career, and never slowed a step in the way that he played. And I think that was a detriment to his overall career. But yeah, yeah, it's easy to say with Hall of Famers, but you look up at some of his total, his WAR stats and being just over 70 for his career. A lot of guys with a lot more compiling, but you talk about in prime players. You give me, heck, probably put him on the mound. You give me 9 Barry Larkins, and that's my team. And I'll go toe to toe with any club that you could assemble with any player out there. Because when he was right, he was absolutely the best player on the field 9 times out of 10 games he played.
Then moving along to the outfield and left, we've got Adam Dunn. In 2004, he hit 46 bombs. This is kind of like the original 3 true outcome player. 46 home runs, 108 walks, 195 strikeouts. Yikes. But he did hit 266, on base percentage of 388 and that 569 slugging. So not great defense out there, but he's not there for his defense. He's there to hit the ball and hit the ball a long ways.
Adam Dunn still to this day owns the single farthest home run I have ever watched in my entire life. They listed it as 535 feet off of Jose Lima, I think in 2004. So that season that you picked, he hit it over the batter's eye and the riverboat in the center field of Great American Ballpark. Technically, it landed in the Ohio River, which is behind the stadium, which is technically Kentucky. So he hit the ball from Ohio to Kentucky.
That's what we call a country mile. And then in center field, we've got Ken Griffey Jr. Unfortunately for Reds fans, he did not have a lot of, long, healthy, sustained seasons there in Cincinnati. We got him in his first year in 2000, worth 5.5 wins, 40 home runs, hit 271, 387, 556. When he was still relatively healthy in Cincinnati. It's kind of, what could have been in Cincinnati was Ken Griffey Jr. You talked about that stadium, but, I was a huge Ken Griffey Jr. fan growing up, favorite player of all time. Bummed that he was not the one to break Hank Aaron's record. It was tough to see his body deteriorate there in Cincinnati. Now, as a Reds fan, what was your perspective of the Griffey era there?
Yeah, it was heartbreaking, really, because it was things that it wasn't that he felt bad, like he was legitimately hurt, like he tore his hamstring off the bone, like you're talking about major surgery kind of stuff, and watching the tail end of his career, and I think he was I'm not looking at it right now, but I think he was worth just over 12 wins total in his entire 9-season career with the Reds, and 5.5 of them came in that first year when it really got so many hopes up because, as I mentioned, he put that year up, and they're building Great American Ballpark right next door to Riverfront. They knocked down the center field wall, and you can see the new stadium being built. It was a very optimistic era in Reds history, and to see it not play out the way that it could have was frustrating. But to see the guy that the Reds traded for him a little bit further down this list is also a little bit of salt in the wound too. So we'll get to that when you get to him.
Yeah, and Griffey, you mentioned Larkin playing on that hard AstroTurf. Griffey, of course, played the first 10 years of his career on that AstroTurf in the Kingdome. So I kind of feel like that may have led to those injuries later on in his career. As we move to right field, we get Reggie Sanders in 1995 with 6.6 wins, 28 home runs, drove in 99, stole 36 bags, triple slash line 306, 397, 579, OPS plus of 155. Impressive year from Reggie Sanders there in right field. Then on the bench, we've got Zach Kozar from 2017. Shortstop solid with the glove. He was worth 5.1 wins. Hit 24 bombs that year. Then Scooter Gennett in 2018 worth 3.3 wins. He hit 23 home runs. Seemed like he was, I remember, I don't know if it was that year when they played the Dodgers, he was just hitting everything. They couldn't get him out. Then as we move to the outfield, you mentioned the player they traded for Griffey, Mike Cameron in 1999. He was worth 5.5 wins, 2.7 wins with the glove. Impressive defensive center fielder. Hit 21 home runs, stole 38 bags. So, Mike Cameron was a dynamic player there. Yeah, as you mentioned, salt on the wound. Kind of, why did they trade for Griffey when they had someone of this caliber?
Yeah, it was frustrating in that regard. But then if you kind of put the pieces together, you're talking about an early odds outfield of the for the Reds of an aging, broken down Ken Griffey Jr. playing next to Adam Dunn. Not exactly the most defensively proficient outfield at that point. And to see a guy like Mike Cameron, who would have ideally been the perfect complement defensively for Dunn, and also very potent offensively in his own right. It was one of those kind of miscalculations, I think. Not that going big and trading for Griffey wasn't the right idea. It didn't work out after the fact, but looking back on the pieces moved, having Cameron around would have been a very nice fit for the other aspects of that defensive outfield.
Yeah, the other bench outfielder, Jose Guillen from 2003, worth 4.7 wins. He hit 23 home runs, hit 337 that year, OPS of over 1,000. So some power off the bench from Guillen. And then the backup catcher, Jason LaRue from 05, worth 2.8 wins, hit 14 home runs, hit 260, slightly better than league average with the stick. A solid defender, 1.3 with the glove. So that's the Cincinnati Reds position players I've assembled for the past 25 years. Before we move to the pitchers, do you have any thoughts on these guys?
It's interesting. I mentioned off air that we did sort of a similar exercise on a much larger time frame. So not all the same names got mentioned, but what we did come across was a lot of 1-year guys. Not a whole lot of guys that spent their career there. Obviously, there are some in Votto and Larkin and Dunn for the most part, but Devin Mesoraco was kind of a 1-year guy. Zach Cozart was a 1-year peak guy who earned himself a lot of money from the Angels based on that one season. Scooter Gennett was kind of a 2-year guy that was sort of a flash in the pan as well. Jose Guillen got treated immediately after that breakout. Mike Cameron did too. So it's a lot of guys that weren't exactly historical figures in Reds lore for being there for a long time, but certainly put up some very good numbers and limited opportunities rather for the Reds.
Now we move to the pitching side. We'll start with the starters. Pete Harnisch in 1998, he went 14-7, ERA of 3.14, over 200 innings that year for the Reds. We've got Elmer Descends in 2002. He went just 7-8, but his ERA was 3.03. So solid year. Just, I don't know, maybe it seemed like he did not get the run support. ERA plus of 141. So despite the lack of wins, solid year from Elmer Descends. Bronson Arroyo from 2006, worth 7 wins. He went 14-11, ERA of about 3.3. Led the league in games started and innings pitched at 240 and 2/3 innings. So workhorse from Bronson Arroyo. Then we've got Dan Straley in 2016. He went 14-8, ERA of 3.76. He's making a name for himself in the KBO right now, especially with all the added attention that the KBO has gotten since it was the first baseball league to resume play. He's looking at getting back to MLB with the way he's thrown over there in Korea, isn't he?
He certainly is, no doubt about it. No, Dan Straley will forever go down in Reds lore, because he put a very good season together for the Reds, basically off the scrap heap at that point. But he also managed to get the Reds Luis Castillo from the Miami Marlins in trade. And I hope that, knock on everything I've possibly got around me right now, that the further removed we get from that deal, the more we'll be excited about what Dan Straley really contributed to the Reds during his brief tenure with the club.
And then rounding out the rotation, we've got Sonny Gray in last year from 2019. He went 11-8, 2.87 ERA. struck out 205 in 175 in the third innings. So a great kind of bounce back year from Sonny Gray, who early in his career looked like a stud, then kind of stagnated a little bit. I believe he was reconnected with his collegiate pitching coach in Cincinnati, and that kind of helped his reemergence.
So I'm conveniently enough, I'm a Vanderbilt grad, and so I followed Vanderbilt baseball for most of my adult life. And yeah, Sonny's back with Derek Johnson. He was not just his pitching coach at Vanderbilt, but was also the guy who recruited him and talked him into going there too. So he's had a very long relationship with him. He's also pitching to Kirk Casale most days as well, who was his catcher at Vandy. And so there's a significant reunion there from a college club that's had a lot of success over the last decade plus. Caleb Cottom is also the assistant pitching coach under Derek Johnson, who actually pitched on the same staff as Sonny. So between kind of getting a little bit closer to his Tennessee roots, getting back to Cincinnati area, and having so many familiar faces there, they tweaked the way he pitched a little bit for sure. They kind of changed the pitch mix back to what he'd done in Oakland, whereas the Yankees had kind of tweaked a little bit of his delivery and some of his offerings. And fortunately, it just took off. We're recording this immediately after Sonny went 6.1 innings of one hit ball against the Cubs and struck out 11. So fortunately, it's continuing to spill over into 2020. And while we don't have enough games to get him to 5.6 wins this year, hopefully, at least on a rate stat perspective, he can continue to replicate what he did last year, because it was great to watch.
Yeah, definitely good to see a pitcher kind of get back to that potential that he showed earlier in his career. Then as we move to the bullpen, we've got a swingman, Tony Cingrani in 2013. The lefty actually started 18 games. I know now he's kind of like a loogie. He started 18 games that year, also came out of the pen a little bit. He went 7-4 with a 2.92 ERA in 104 2/3 innings. In 1997, we've got Jeff Shaw. Now, a reliever, Jeff Shaw, was worth 3.6 wins, which actually led the Reds team in 97. He went 4-2, 2.38 ERA. He made 78 appearances and threw 94 2/3 innings, led the league with 42 saves, 6.17 strikeouts to walk. So great strikeout to walk ratio there. Just a dominant year from a reliever. Not huge strikeout numbers, 7 per 9, but stingy with the walk. Less than a walk in less than one walk per 9 innings. So, it's not often you see a reliever rack up that much WAR, but Jeff Shaw did it that year. Great year from Shaw.
And to tie the Jim Bowden years, it featured lots of trades and lots of short tenures, which we mentioned above. I think Jeff Shaw was actually traded the next year, right before the All-Star game, because he represented the Dodgers, even though his first year he had made the All-Star team as a Red.
His first time wearing a Dodger uniform was in that All-Star game.
Right, and he was traded for Paul Konerko.
Yes,
and Paul Konerko was eventually traded for Mike Cameron. So all the trade tree from the late '90s Jim Bowden era is really, really hard to keep up with, because it's absolutely everywhere. But those three all have a very interesting tied together history.
Then moving along in the pen, we've got Scott Sullivan in 01. He went 7-1. Impressive to get that many decisions out of the pen. 3.3 ERA. 79 appearances, 103.1 innings. So, a workhorse out of the pen that year. You don't see relievers rack up that many innings anymore.
You don't, but you also didn't see the starting rotation of the early odds Reds rack up a lot of innings either.
Then we've got Jared Burton from 07. He went 4-2, ERA of 2.5. Jeremy Affeldt, the loogie, in 08, he was worth 1 win. He went 1-1 with a 3.3 ERA. Actually pitched 78 1/3 innings that year, so that was kind of before he really settled into that loogie position that he did later in his career with the Giants. Then we've got Francisco Cordero in 09. Went 2-6, but he had an ERA of 2.16 in 66 2/3 innings. And as we round out the bullpen, we've got Aroldis Chapman in 2012, 5-5, ERA of 1.5, 71 2/3 innings. He struck out 122 batters That's 15.3 strikeouts per nine. Just impressive, dominant year from Chapman. And in Chapman's early years with Cincinnati, he was just electric.
So I actually witnessed Aroldis Chapman's last start. We were in Goodyear, Arizona for spring training in 2012. They were still trying to stretch him out to be a starter because obviously he had not broken into the big leagues yet, but had that electric arm, was one of the top pitching prospects in all of baseball, as a big money signing out of Cuba. And we were there. We were actually talking to Cincinnati Enquirer beat writer John Fay at the time when he got the call that Ryan Madson had torn his UCL. And Madson had signed a one-year deal with the Reds to be the closer that year. But this was a Reds club that was hell-bent on contending at that point, didn't have a whole lot of other options, and basically said, well, the best arm we've got that could be a closer right now is Aroldis Chapman. We know we've tried him as a starter in spring training all spring. We're going to take him to the big leagues, and he's going to be our closer. We'll try it for now, and maybe we'll get back to seeing him start later. And obviously, here we are, 8 full years later, and he is one of the elite closers in the game. So we had high hopes because Reds rotation wasn't anything special for the longest time. And to have that good of a pitching prospect was like, oh, we've got a great starter. It's going to be fantastic. And then boom, that happened, and the series of events played out immediately afterwards. 2012 was a fantastic year. I'm glad he got to contribute the way he did. Still have that what if with him, though, is that if Madson stays healthy to start the season, maybe we see Chapman as a starter, and who knows what happens from there on out.
Yeah, and one thing I don't know if a lot of people know about Aroldis Chapman, but he is a phenomenal athlete. The rumors say, I don't know if they're still true since he's older, but he was like the fastest guy in the bigs, faster than Billy Hamilton, and also like the strongest guy, just outlifting everyone else. So tremendous athlete. His flexibility is incredible, which that kind of goes into how he's able to throw at such high velocity.
Yeah, he's 6'4", he's lean, he's athletic. I know for a fact he ran neck and neck in an outfield sprint at that spring training with Drew Stubbs, who you might remember as former leadoff hitter, phenomenal athlete out of the University of Texas, who I think also ran track well at Texas, at least a limited bit as well. But guy who was always known for his speed, and he and Chapman were dead heat racing in the outfield. And if he was as fast as Stubbs was at that point, I would put him up against basically anybody in baseball at that point too.
It'd be nice to see him maybe pinch run in this new extra inning rule we've got, put him on second base. But yeah, that's the pitching staff I've assembled. We don't need to touch on who's missing yet. We'll get into that. But what do you think of this pitching staff that I've got here?
Elmer DeSenz has a very fond place in my heart because for the longest time he was the only pitcher that the Reds had that had put up over 10 wins for the Reds in his career in a incredibly large gap, basically from Jose Rijo until the 2010-2013 era. It was DeSenz, and that was it. And so not to say he was an elite level ace caliber pitcher, but was certainly a guy who I thought was a little underrated at the time and was also pretty much the only workhorse the Reds could throw out there. And then always have a soft spot for Bronson. You have to have a soft spot for Bronson because he threw as soft as anybody in baseball. But you have to admire somebody who was able to have as much success as he did, flipping 65-mile-an-hour frisbees up there most of the time when you got guys like Chapman on the same staff throwing 105. So, it's a fun group. It's certainly good memories looking back at some of these names, no doubt about it.
So that there you have it. Now, if we've got any Reds fans listening, you want to share your opinion with my roster, let me have it. You can find me on Twitter. It's at Boxseat Banter, and also on Instagram at Boxseat Banter. And if you guys are inspired and want to make a roster of your own, you can visit my website, boxseatbanter.com. There is a template to download a Google spreadsheet, and you can create your own roster. I'd love to see any submissions. Compare them to mine. We can see, try to create a better roster than mine. I'm sure Reds fans can. So I would love to see those submissions. So now as I make these rosters, there's always those decisions that I struggle with, debate, go back and forth. And as I put these players into the, fill out this puzzle here. Now, Wick, do you see any notable players who are missing from my roster?
the hitters on this group are pretty hard to argue with. There's no denying that. That's a pretty thorough group. The two guys that stood out most, I think, were both pitchers. I think it was 2006. I'm checking this right now. Yeah, it was 2006. Aaron Harang was the first player in National League history to lead the league in both wins and strikeouts and not win the Cy Young. And he didn't get a single vote that year. Obviously, he had 3.6 or 3.76 ERA at that point, 124 ERA plus. Things weren't valued as well then, I think, as they are now. But still, wins at that point and strikeouts were something that were had always been very heavily weighed in voting for those kind of awards. And not a great baseball team, but I thought Harang had a great year that year. He was actually better in terms of wins by replacement the next year. At six wins that year after 5.3. But that particular weird trivia bit is one thing that stands out as my mind as a guy that just is perennially overlooked by a lot of people.
Yeah, no, he was. He, as you mentioned, was decent in 07. I went with Bronson Arroyo in 06 over him. Now, he pitched for the Dodgers a little bit. Harang did, and at least online, there was a little nickname that we had for him. Do you remember any nickname? Did you guys have a nickname for Harang?
We called him the orangutan.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Exactly. So I don't know if that came from Cincinnati or what, but the Dodgers, I know, also referred to him as the orangutan.
He also literally got the nickname overlooked in part because of that 2-year window when he was good but didn't get any votes the first year. He finished fourth in the Cy Young voting the next year. So I think people got word that he had actually been pretty good the year before for the next season. But the joke was he's like 6'8", 270 pounds. Like he's the most unoverlookable human being on the planet. Put up this one big year and didn't get any reward for it. So but he was it was an interesting era of Cincinnati Reds baseball for sure. We hadn't had really any dominant starting pitching in a while, and he was kind of that first guy. And I think it took a lot of people a while to realize, wow, you've actually got a decent pitcher in Cincinnati who can keep the ball in Great American Ballpark. Oh, all right. So.
All right. And so you mentioned there were two pitchers. So who was the other pitcher who was absent?
So conveniently enough, since the Reds game ended, I flipped over on MLB TV behind the camera over here, and I'm watching Johnny Cueto pitch for the Giants against the Padres.
Yeah.
And Cueto, for one, the numbers have been phenomenal for most of his career when he's been able to stay healthy. But he's just one of the more quirky, intricate pitchers you'll ever come across. And so he's been a fan favorite of mine since the moment I saw him as a prospect in 2008. So he's the other one that jumped out at me. Not that there aren't a lot of good selections on here, but it was like, there's got to be Cueto because the Reds don't have a whole lot of history of very good starting pitching. And he had a couple fantastic years with the Reds.
Yeah, absolutely. He was definitely the biggest absence that I felt on this team. It was basically, I think one of his great years was 2014. And I was struggling with, the catching position, as you mentioned, kind of Devin Mesoraco had that 1 year in 2014. So even though Cueto was better than Mesoraco that year, I felt I needed to get a catcher. But yeah, the starting pitchers really do lack without Cueto's presence there. I think he had a couple other good years for Cincinnati. ERAs like around 2.25. So great years. Should have been on this roster. That's my kind of one regret is not finding a place for him. But as I filled out this puzzle, I just could not fit him in.
You can blame the fact that Reds catchers haven't been very good for the last 25 years on having to take Mesoraco that year. So no, Cueto finished second in the Cy Young in 2014, which for Reds fans is a Cy Young because the Reds have never had a Cy Young Award winner. So to finish second is the highest one for a Reds pitcher in the long storied history of the franchise. So that always stands out. But Mez in 2014 it earned him a lifetime changing contract for sure, rightfully so. But it was also kind of the fallout of some of the moves made before that because the Reds chose Mesoraco effectively over Yasmani Grandal as the catcher of the future and used Grandal in the major trade with the Padres to bring in Matt Latos, who fizzled later in his career, but really did have 3 fantastic years for the Reds, helping anchoring that 2012, 2013 clubs. So a big deal at the time. one that in 2014 looked like, hey, they made the right call, and here we are now, and not so much.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, the Padres never really got any value out of Grandal.
That's true. Also, that's quite true.
Yeah, I think he was part of the trade with Matt Kemp that sent Kemp to San Diego and brought Grandal to LA. And then to bring it full circle again, I believe Kemp was traded along with Puig to Cincinnati, correct?
That's correct. And to continue the loop, the Reds tried hard to sign Yasmani Grandal this offseason, and he picked the White Sox over them. So you wonder if any of that lingering 2012 trade might have had something to do with it.
As they say, baseball players have a long memory, so
they
perhaps. Some of the other players, just to briefly touch on, who I struggled with, as I was doing this, man, Arthur Rhodes was still kicking around in 2010, and he was an all-star that year. So I was just impressed. He had a long career, like about 20 years.
Yeah, he had a fantastic run, short run when he was turning 40 with the Reds. But was great on that team. Absolutely.
Yeah. Some players who I, kind of thought would get on here. We didn't have the mayor, Sean Casey, and we didn't have Jay Bruce on here either. Now, Bruce was, one of those draft picks, top prospects that, they kind of thought was going to be the guy. Had some good years there, has had a solid career, but I don't know if he's developed into that player that they thought he was going to. And Sean Casey, just, associated with him there. He's a, big name, the mayor, great nickname. You don't see nicknames like that anymore. Great nickname. But yeah, those are a couple guys. And in 2018, I don't know why I picked Jeanette over Suarez, because I think looking back, Suarez had better numbers. So I don't know what I was thinking there. Maybe that was a mistake. And I'm bummed that I could not get Castillo on there or Lorenzen. Lorenzen, you could argue as a two-way player. For Castillo, it came down to essentially him or Sonny Gray last year. But, as this team keeps going, if you do this again, after this year or next year, I think, then you definitely have room for both Gray and Castillo.
That's the hope. That's certainly the hope. The Reds picked Sonny Gray to start opening day this year after Castillo started last year. They basically came out and said, look, we love them both. They both could have done it. They both were well qualified and well deserving of it. But yeah, Sonny's year last year, the numbers don't lie, especially during the second half. I mean, I think I once again, I'm not looking at it because it was on Twitter as it flew past earlier, but after his start tonight, I think he's got a 1.79 ERA over his last 115 innings pitched dating back to last year. Basically, if it wasn't for Jack Flaherty finishing the way he did, I think Sonny would have probably won 2, if not 3, NL Pitcher of the Month awards last year, and is off to a very good start at hoping to win one this year too. So.
Yeah, so definitely, potentially bright future with those pitchers there in Cincinnati. But yeah, those were the decisions that I struggled with the most in assembling this roster. Now it's time for our Q&A segment. We post questions on Twitter and Instagram, so make sure you follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Again, it's at Boxseat Banter on both Twitter and Instagram. Our first question comes from Adam Foskey. He asks, what are your thoughts about Iglesias' role on the Reds and if he deserves to be the full-time closer? Based on his comments alone last year, I was through with him, and then his 2019 season just exacerbated the situation. Now he picks up right where he left off. What can and should the Reds do?
Yeah, so the Reds started the season their first 3 starting pitchers through, I think, 18 1/3 innings pitched, allowed 2 earned runs, struck out 33, walked 3, and they lost 2 of those 3 games. In large part because the bullpen just completely collapsed twice. Then they did it again against the Cubs to start the season also. And while Iglesias has not been behind all of that, he was behind one of them. And it continued an alarming trend that started last year. I mean, he had 12 losses, which pitcher wins and losses don't really mean anything in the grand scheme. But when you're a team's closer and you lose that many games, that's indicative of how many times you got handed a lead or a tie game and simply gave up runs. And that's the exact opposite of what you hope to get from any guy at the back of the bullpen, much less somebody who is as talented as he is. He can throw 98 miles an hour. He has a devastating slider. He hides the ball incredibly well when he's on. But he's gotten so homer prone over the last year and a half that it really makes you wonder if somebody else might be better suited for the job. The problem is, answering that question, is that the guy who's probably most suited for that is Michael Lorenzen, who has already given up 2 home runs this year and looks just as lost as Iglesias does. And so, relievers year to year, it's so hard to know what you're going to get. Iglesias is the guy they're paying big money to. He inked a 3-year, $24 million contract that he's in the middle of right now. I think you have to ride it out. One thing has become very clear, though, which is that he's not nearly as effective when he gets put into games that are tied versus when he gets put in safe situations. And while the viewpoints on traditional closers have gotten a little bit more evolved over the last few years, it really seems like he's that guy who thrives off the adrenaline of, I'm closing this out. And that's the only way he really pitches well. So maybe that's what you put him in, just for a pure comfort zone perspective, and go a little bit against the numbers in that regard, especially when you've got expanded rosters and you've got more arms that you can use right now. Put somebody else in a tie game, keep Iglesias as the closer if that's what makes him happy at this point, because you can't keep sacrificing games by putting him in situations where he's just not getting the job done.
Yeah, so there you have it. I guess the best answer might be to wait it out and put him in better positions to succeed. Yeah, he does have electric stuff, but yeah, it gives up probably more than it seems like he should. Moving on to our next question, we've got Joey, who asks, the Reds rotation looks stronger than it's been for many years. How much credit goes to the front office for the moves to acquire those guys versus coaching and development staff?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's obviously it's a two-headed beast, but
Right.
you look back at the moves the Reds made in this rebuild and why it's taken 6 full years to try to get out of it. In part, it's because of some of the moves that they made and some of the players that they couldn't develop. We talked about Johnny Cueto earlier on. He got traded to the Royals and went on to win a World Series with them. The Reds got 3 top prospect pitchers back in return. They got Cody Reed, who gave up a home run in the 9th inning tonight. John Lamb, who's not with the organization anymore, and Brandon Finnegan, who is with the organization but off the roster after 2 shoulder surgeries. So another instance of them going out and getting in young pitchers that are supposed to be the future. Was that a front office error or was that a development error? It's got to be both, because they didn't pan out. As a result, they had to find Straley off the scrap heap, trade him to Luis Castillo, and hope Castillo turned into something better than the 3 previous pitching prospects did. I want to say it's the front office's job always, because finding arm talent is the one thing that you have to do. Health becomes the big issue after that. As I mentioned, John Lamb had Tommy John surgery. Finnegan had multiple shoulder surgeries. Knock on everything, the guys that the Reds currently have right now that they got from outside the organization, Sonny Gray, Luis Castillo, Wade Miley, Trevor Bauer, Anthony DeSclafani, who's missing 1 start but is coming back. They got him in the Matt Latos deal. So these are all guys that were not drafted and developed by the Reds. But they're guys that some of them were under the radar guys. That Castillo was traded twice, almost 3 times in his career before landing with the Reds. The Marlins tried to trade him twice before he actually ended up with the Reds. DeSclafani was flipped for Matt Latos. Under the radar guys that they did develop. And then also the high profile guys like Sonny Gray and Trevor Bauer, who were established products before getting there. I think it's always the front office is the buck stops there with them, because they're the ones who has to provide the opportunity for coaches to do their work. So I think ultimately that's who's responsible. I think they're responsible for the rebuild taking as long as it did, but also hopefully being responsible for getting the pitchers that take us out of the rebuild too.
Yeah, and now I know somebody who was not involved in the past, but will be involved going forward. They've got Kyle Bodie from Driveline Baseball. I think he's the minor league pitching director. Is that his position?
He's the guru. I'm blanking on his exact title right now also, but yeah, he's in charge of the scope of Cincinnati Reds franchise pitching.
Yeah, so he's done a lot of really groundbreaking stuff there at Driveline, and so he's worked with several pitchers, several big league pitchers. I know Trevor Bauer is a huge Driveline guy, and so now he's got a chance to mold those minor leaguers, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out for the Reds. It could be a huge boost for their young arms. And we've got one more question. This is also from Joey. This is not as in-depth as his prior question. Who's the best guy on the 25-year roster, and why is it Barry Larkin?
Well, as I mentioned in my effusive praise for Larkin earlier, a guy who literally could do it all. He could steal you 60 bases if you wanted. He was the fastest player on the team, except when he played with Eric Davis when Eric Davis was healthy. But Eric Davis was faster than everybody. Elite defensive shortstop. We're looking at the year that you picked, his 96 season, 96 walks for his 52 strikeouts. He made the transition from being a leadoff guy on a World Series team to hitting in the middle of the order and finding a way to hit 30, 35 home runs in back-to-back years. Could be a run producer when you needed him, but could also be the run scorer when you needed him. Played the toughest defensive position and was a Cincinnati lifer. I mean, he is, if you had to go back through the entire history of all of the Cincinnati Reds, there's Johnny Bench, there's Joe Morgan, there's the Big Red Machine guys. I'm not sure there's somebody who is more emblematic of the Reds as a whole, because there's a long 45 years since the Big Red Machine was around, which involved a lot of not winning and pain and suffering as well. Larkin went through all that. He dealt with all the injuries, but stuck with the Reds, turned down a trade to the Mets, spent his entire career there, had ups and downs, but when he was right, was just the consummate baseball player. And I would take 9 of him over any other player I think I've ever watched. And I mean that sincerely. Might lose to Mike Trout once or twice, but I've not seen Mike Trout play shortstop, so I don't know.
Yeah, they, if you take their Reds career into account, then or Barry Larkin, definitely the best player on here. Career-wise overall, I would go with Griffey, but Griffey as a Red, what was a shell of his former self. So it really leads you to, kind of Larkin and Votto as the 2 best players on here. But yeah, I'll go with the shortstop, every day of the week and twice on Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, Votto's calling card. He's done plenty of other good things too. He's a 300, 400, 500 guy. He's a 308 career batter. I mean, he gets plenty of credit for walking as he well should, but he's going to hit 350, 400 home runs before his career is done. He's going to bat 300 for his career. Brings that to the table, but his calling card is that on-base percentage over 400. I'm looking at Larkin's year right now, and it's 410. You're talking about 410 from a guy who brings that much more to the table. It's Larkin, and that's probably why he's my favorite player who's ever played the game of baseball.
Yeah, so we appreciate all those questions coming in. Again, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Keep sending those questions in, and we'll get to them. I love the interaction with the fans, and we look forward to those future questions. Now it's time to grade the roster. So, Wick, looking at this roster I've created, how would you grade it? What would maybe be the strengths and weaknesses, and what would be a letter grade for it?
Yeah, so just the stark numbers are getting 67 wins out of your offense total. That's got to be pretty middle of the pack, I would think. I mean, there's certainly some bright spots in there, but there've been a lot of really good seasons by a lot of teams and a lot of players out there. But it's the pitching staff that drags this down, and it's what's really hampered the franchise throughout the bulk of the last 25 years. Even in the good years they've had in 95 and 99, they struggled having pitching staff that could stay healthy and that could give them more than 2 or 3 starts in a row. I think that's certainly reflected in this also. It's been the story of the Cincinnati Reds since the Jim Bowden era, which is try to find a way to put a pitching staff together that could be realistic, and they've struggled to do it. So, the offense, I think you could probably stack up with a lot of teams and come out with some pretty good wins against them, but that pitching staff's going to get pounded. So, I don't think it's too positive, to be honest. I think you throw a BB plus offense in there with a C minus D plus pitching staff, and that's kind of what you end up with, is somewhere in between.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you. The starters are the weak spot, especially without Cueto. If I'm able to get him in there, it definitely brings the starting rotation, makes it a little more serviceable. But then we lose, kind of any production out of the catcher spot. But, the bullpen is surprisingly decent. I mean, you've obviously got Chapman, huge year out of Shaw. So some dominant arms out of the pen. I don't know if they can make up for all of the shortcomings of the starting rotation. As you mentioned, the offense is decent. On base, slugging, and OPS are all above average. Um, Defensively, they're solid. They're pretty above average defensively compared to the other rosters I've created. But aside from those rate stats of OBP, slugging, and OPS, they're slightly below average on some of their other offensive numbers. Um, so, overall, I'm going to give this team a D overall. And it's, mainly because of the starters. You go back 25 years and most teams can put together like a few aces. But I was unable to do that with this Reds team. But, going forward, that could be very different. But, as far as this project goes, we're looking at the past 25 years, not the next 25 years. So, yeah, I give these guys a D overall, but
it's also, I think it's a little bit of an indictment of the single year
right.
Mandate for this, because as we've seen with the Reds for the last 25 years, they've had 4 really good years, 1 kind of good year, and 20 really bad years. And so I think a lot of their good seasons,
right, they all
because
coincided.
They had a lot of overlap on there also.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's that's kind of been what it's been like as a Reds fan, where you kind of hibernate for 5 years and then hope they come out of the woodwork and do something. Which, as a segue, I'm hoping 2020 is one of those years, despite the 2-4 start. So.
All right, so yeah, those are our grades, and if you want to chime in, let me know what you think of my roster, and if you want to again make your own, I would love to see those submissions. As we wrap up here, Wick, what are your final thoughts on the Reds organization? Maybe if you want to share any more thoughts. I know we've touched on this roster a lot, and anything about the Reds going forward. What have you got for us?
Yeah, so I mentioned I was a child of the 80s who was just old enough in 1990 to really fall in love with this club. The Bengals made the Super Bowl after the 89 season also. So it was like, boom, Cincinnati sports are awesome. And it's been, we talked earlier. I was like, can you stretch it out to 30 years instead of 25 years for this product? It's been a long grind as a Cincinnati sports fan. I'm not as much of a Bengals fan now as little me was, but Reds fandom's still in there. And I think this is a pretty good indictment of the fact that it's been a rough road of things for the Reds for a long time. And I think that's something that the city knows. They all, I've been in Colorado now for 8+ years. I moved and my wife and I live out here now. But Cincinnati's still home. The area's home. That's where all my family is. And I'm back there, not in 2020 because travel and whatnot, but I'm back there as often as I can be. And it'll forever be a big part of who my sports fandom is. But yeah, the last 25 years ish, it's been rough, and so that's why we keep holding out hope that the Reds are going to dig their way out. And I think that's why this past winter, going out and spending $160 million on Mike Moustakas and Nick Castellanos and Shogo Akiyama, Wade Miley, making that commitment to go trade for Trevor Bauer, all those kind of things are something that I think Reds fans desperately needed to see. And also kind of wondered why it hadn't happened in more years, to be honest. But I am looking up at this, and there are some bright spots. Hopefully you end up with 4, maybe 5 Hall of Famers out of this group. Larkin and Griffey, obviously. Scott Rowland, I hope, gets in at some point soon. I anticipate Joey Votto will be able to finish out his career with enough good numbers and the support of sabermetric Baseball Writers of America voters who will support his style of play. And then who knows with Aroldis Chapman. The off-the-field stuff obviously is going to drag him down, but if he keeps putting up those kind of peripheral numbers as a reliever, maybe he gets them someday too. So there have been some bright spots, but it certainly is a franchise that is looking for some good news and soon. And so I think that's why we were all so excited about getting this 2020 season underway, because in theory, the Reds should have a chance to kind of put themselves back on the map.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when I made this roster, like you just kind of mentioned in the previous segment, it was tough because a lot of good years, from players coincided with other players in the same year, those successful teams that they had. So I could not get everyone I wanted on it. And as you mentioned, it was a disappointing era for the Reds. However, again, as we've been touching on all podcasts, the future is looking up for them. They've got those three great pitchers right now in Gray, Castillo, and Bauer. You kind of took the words out of my mouth with some of the players who they've acquired, Castellanos, Moustakas, who I think made his debut for them tonight after getting healthy from, COVID, and hit a bomb tonight. And, Suarez is a good young player. So they've got some guys, and we'll see what the future's like. I expect a much more successful next 25 years from the Reds than the past 25 years have been.
I just at least hope for a commitment to trying. I feel like there've been so many years where they've just rolled out a roster to start that it's just like, no, this one's just not going to be good enough. And you knew it from the start, and you hope, and then 50 games in, you're done and looking for the trade deadline again. So, I think the two kind of go to hand in hand. Yeah, you put together a roster that on paper looks like it should be good. More times than not will end up being better, than not. So I hope the Reds at least continue to stay committed to that. I think that's something the ownership group has kind of suggested they're going to do. This was the first step, putting together what they did. I think they've built themselves a nice little window to be very, very good for 2, 3, 4 years. And hopefully they can make that materialize, because there's a big Reds fan base out there that has kind of been a little bit dormant for a while. It's just itching for something to root for.
Yeah. And Wick, I loved having you on the show. You brought a lot of knowledge, more than I can expect, more than I can provide for the Reds. So it was a pleasure to have you on. Again, is at Wick Terrell. If you want to share your Twitter and the Red Reporter as well.
Yeah, you can find us. I'm on Twitter at Wick Terrell. I also run the Red Reporter account, which is at Red Reporter. You can find us on Facebook at Red Reporter Fans. We don't really interact a ton over there, but we do try to share most all of our stuff. And then redreporter.com. That's where we are on the SB Nation network. And we like to think that we're a analytically slanted community. So there certainly will be plenty of that. But we also like to have fun. We make jokes, and we try to keep it light, which in theory is what happens when you cover the 2014 to 2019 Reds. You kind of have to keep it a little bit light. And we've been doing it. It's been more or less the same core group over there for about the last 10 years. And I think we're all as excited as anyone else to potentially have a chance to cover a team that wins some games again this year too. So check us out, and hopefully the Reds stay relevant enough to where you want to come check us out and see what's going on over there.
Yeah, they are one of my sleeper picks in that NL Central this year, and that was even before they announced that expanded playoffs. So with the expanded playoffs, the Reds got a great chance to make it. That is, of course, if we can get through this season. So again, a quick reminder. Again, I am on Twitter at WBallis. The Box Seat Banter is at Box Seat Banter on both Twitter and Instagram. You can visit the website, boxseatbanter.com. Again, one more time, thank you, Wick, for joining us. This is Billy Ballas of Box Seat Banter, signing off.